Simply that if you understood history in this Marxist Hegelian sense of an evolutionary process that was leading to a certain kind of society, that for many years since Karl Marx, most progressive intellectuals had said that the direction or the end of history would be some form of communism or socialism. And in 1989, I simply observed that we weren't going to get there, and that if we're going to go in any particular direction, it looked like we were going to stop at the penultimate station before you got to communism in Marx's scheme. That is to say, liberal democracy, bourgeois liberal democracy, and a market economy. And for reasons that we can discuss a bit later, I think that that's still a valid conclusion. And in fact, since 1970, when there were only about 35 electoral democracies anywhere in the world, up till 2011, when there are about 110 to 115, there has in fact been an explosion of democracy around the world, and there has been a tremendous quadrupling of global output, largely due to the fact that countries like Russia and China now participate in a global capitalist world economy. So in many respects, I think the directionality is still there, but the year 2014, to be quite honest, is not a good one. And I think that a lot of the trends that we've seen indicate some serious developments in global politics that may put that story in some jeopardy. In Eurasia, at both ends of Eurasia, you've got Russia and China, which are consolidated, centralized, very powerful states. They've got territorial ambitions and they're on the move. They're very self-confident, and that is posing some very serious foreign policy challenges to the United States, to Europe, and to other Western countries. But the part of the world that I think is the most troubling is actually very much the topic of my current book, which is what Zbigniew Brzezinski used to call the arc of crisis, which goes from North Africa through sub-Saharan Africa into the Arab world and all the way into Pakistan and Afghanistan. That world is completely different from the Russia-China world because it is characterized by either weak states or, in the case of Libya, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, basically failed or quasi-failed states, in which the problem is exactly the opposite. The problem is the absence of state authority. For reasons I can explain in the Q&A, I actually don't think that ISIS is a terribly impressive or great threat. I think the reason that it seems like it's a very powerful force is that everybody around it is so weak and so disorganized. And if you think about where Islamic terrorism has been spreading, it was pushed out of Afghanistan into Pakistan, then pushed into Yemen, and then pushed further into the Sahel in sub-Saharan Africa. So now it's in Mali and Cameroon and northern Nigeria. The only reason that it's gone into these places is that this is where there's a complete vacuum of state authority, in which you have countries that are basically too weak to keep basic order. And this has meant that the challenge for American foreign policy in the years following September 11th has been actually nation building or state building, because the only way to deal with this problem was to prop up the central regimes in places like Afghanistan and Iraq so that those countries could actually take care of this problem that any normal consolidated state should be able to handle. And I think, unfortunately, the 13 years since September 11th has taught us and taught me that we're not very good at this. And so this is the problem that I labeled getting to Denmark, where Denmark is not actually the country Denmark. It is an imagined place that is well-governed, democratic, peaceful, secure, prosperous, and with very, very low levels of corruption. And the problem, that we face is trying to turn Somalia or Haiti or Afghanistan or Iraq into some version of Denmark, and we don't get very far. And the reason, I think, is that we don't understand how Denmark itself got to be Denmark. I think, as someone that had a visiting professorship in Denmark, I can tell you most Danes have no idea how they got to be what they are, because, there were 800 years ago, there were ferocious Vikings, spearing each other, and Now they're somewhat different. And so much of the institutional development of the Western, the modern world, is so buried in the mists of time that we've actually forgotten how that happened. So this is the beginning of this project. This is why I wrote these two volumes, The Origins of Political Order and Political Decay, because I wanted to uncover some of the history of the origins of those institutions. Now, in order to understand my basic framework, we have to do some definitions. What is a political order? And in my view, there are three basic pillars of a modern polity. The first pillar is the state. So the state is a legitimate monopoly of force. It is an organization, a hierarchical organization that can generate the power that is necessary to enforce laws, defend the community against foreigners, to keep domestic peace, to do infrastructure, to deliver services like health and education. And so the state is all about generating and using power. The second important set of institutions has to do with the rule of law. The rule of law is not just laws on the books that are enforced on the population. If the law does not apply to the most powerful individuals in a particular society, it's not the rule of law. So if the president or the king or the prime minister can make up rules as they go along, that is not the rule of law. The rule of law is fundamentally, in political terms, a constraint on power. The third pillar is democratic accountability. We understand this procedurally in the West as a series of institutions like free and fair multi-party elections, but the purpose of the procedures is to build substantive accountability, which means the government ought to be responsive to the needs of the whole society and not just of the people that actually run the government. And so you can see that a modern political order is actually a balance between, on the one hand, the state that concentrates and uses power, and on the other hand, two institutions of constraint, the rule of law and democratic accountability, that try to limit power and make sure that power is used in the interests of the whole community, or as close to that as you can come. Every country in the world can be classified in terms of what particular combination of these three institutions they have, and I argue simply that if you don't have a balance, you're in trouble. So if you have a very weak state, but you've got institutions of constraint, and to some extent that's what's existing now in a place like Afghanistan, where they have elections or election-like events periodically that produce legitimated leaders, but they don't have a state, and they cannot enforce laws, and they cannot protect their own population. Or you get an even more extreme version of that that we're seeing in Syria or Libya right now, where basically anybody with an AK-47 and an RPG can pull together a militia and take whatever they want, and nobody is secure in that kind of a stateless society. So that's not a good balance. On the other hand, if you are like China, and I argued in the first volume that China actually was the first society to create a modern state, but you do not have the other two institutions, you don't have rule of law or you don't have democratic accountability, then what you end up with is a tyranny. And that's not a good situation to be in either. Now, there's another really important definition that I think is at the core of our political problem in the world today, which is the difference between a modern state and what you would call, I'm sorry to use these long words, but this comes actually also from the sociologist Max Weber, either a patrimonial or a neo-patrimonial state. Professor Joseph knows all about this because he's written about this at great length in sub-Saharan Africa. A modern state tries to be impersonal. That is to say, it treats citizens equally without regard to whether they are a personal friend or relative of the ruler. And there's a clear distinction between public and private. The state is meant to serve a public interest and not the private interest of the people running the government. A patrimonial state, a classic patrimonial state, was like a kingdom where the king could actually give away an entire province to his daughter as a wedding present because he literally owned the whole country. So today, nobody in the world actually has the guts to get up and say, I actually own this country and I can do whatever I want with it. They all pretend to have parliaments and bureaucracies and elections and shows of impersonality. But the reality in a neo-patrimonial state is that, in effect, the state is being run for the private interest of the ruling class, or the people that run the state. And so it is kind of a rent-sharing oligarchy. And the reason that people get into politics is not for any concept of public good or for implementing public policies that they believe in. It is simply for self-enrichment. And that means that corruption is rampant, because corruption absolutely depends on eroding the difference between public and private and appropriating public money for private uses. And in my view, this is the single big dividing line in the world right now. It is less the dividing line between authoritarian and democratic states. I mean, Americans, and you know, I plead guilty to this myself, we have focused a great deal in the past on that divide, and that is certainly a big and important one. But in many respects, some of the biggest conflicts are actually between either patrimonial or neo-patrimonial states and modern states. I'll give you several examples. Start with Ukraine, where we've had, you know, fortunately an election on Sunday that turned out, I think, about as well as anyone could expect. But the turmoil there was driven not really over democracy, because Viktor Yanukovych, the president that was pushed out of office in February by the young protesters in Maidan Square, was, by all accounts, democratically elected in a pretty free and fair election. Nobody was contesting that. The reason that these protesters did not want him as their president was that he was running one of these insider rackets. So I don't know if you saw this big mansion that he was building on the outskirts of Kiev. It was several times the size of the White House, basically funneling billions of dollars of state resources for the benefit of his family outside of the country. And those young people really were saying, when they wanted to align with Europe, they were saying, we want to live in a modern society in which there is a distinction between public and private, and the government serves the public interest of Ukraine and not the private interest of just the, you know, the president and his family. And that's really what's going on in our fight with Vladimir Putin, the West's conflict with Putin over Ukraine, because Putin, again, if there's an election in Russia today, would be elected by a big majority of Russians. There's no question about that. But the problem with his regime is not that it's not democratic. The problem is it is one of these neo-patrimonial rent-sharing oligarchies in which your property rights go only as far as the government sees fit, you know, to respect them. And that's really, you know, one of the central conflicts out there in the world today. But even if you go to a number of democracies, you have a very similar kind of problem. Take India. India has been an extremely successful democracy ever since the founding of the Indian Republic in the late 1940s.